So after mostly preparing most of my message, I decided that the actual reading for today is too long. And if you want to try to catch me in something, if you read the scripture yourself, when listed in the bulletin, you'll find where I'm working from. So I'm not going to read the whole scripture. I am going to read from little pieces of it as I go. But it's a really long reading, and some of you know how well I do when my tongue-tiedness sometimes comes out. So we're going to... No, you were thinking it. Okay. That's that communication thing. I don't look her way because I might get the eye sometimes. So anyway. So the next few weeks, a couple of weeks more, I guess, in the past couple of weeks, I didn't really formally say it, but we're doing, I guess, a little skipping through John. In fact, I'm not even using the whole story. Hopefully I'm giving you enough of a flavor. You go, I think there's more to that story. And last week we had Nicodemus, and he's a little bit of the absolute opposite of the main character that we have today. Nicodemus himself was, he was up there. He had the good job. He was a very formal, very respected man. Probably had a great family, well educated because of his role and being a teacher of the law. He had probably a good reputation to the point that it was pretty much everybody's opinion, not just the other people in the Sanhedrin. He would have been considered a really very sincere and profound guy, and we know that what happens is he does something a little weird. Last week he came to talk to Jesus because he had some questions, and we didn't finish his story. We just talked about the fact that Jesus sort of tore down what he had built his life on, which was to be religious was going to get him to see heaven, but he had some doubts, and Jesus started addressing those in our reading last week. Well, this week we've moved to John 4. And I moved down to 5 through 26. I think I sent out 3 different emails about how big the scripture was going to be. And I got here this morning, Steve says, well, is it still the one you sent? I said, which one did you get last? So, I had to make sure that, so usually I have, lately especially, I've had to modify what they put on the screen by the time I get here. And so I appreciate them making corrections for me sort of on the fly. So this week we're talking about a person who, like I said, is a little more of the opposite. Nicodemus, of course, was a man. We have this unnamed woman, so that's one big difference. And then we know that she's probably not in the most rich section of town. We don't know where she lives for sure, but we know that there's some circumstances that we'll get into today that probably means that she's just sort of getting along in the community. She's not considered righteous, and we'll talk about some of those things as well. And here she is. She is not going to consult with a rabbi when she meets up with Jesus. The rabbi looks like has been seeking her out. If you read the section right before, Jesus chooses to go back through Samaria so that he can go back toward Galilee. And so he makes a choice, and it says he had to, but actually it was a choice because there were other routes to go, and most Jews, if they were the really righteous Jews, took another path that kept them from going into Samaria. And we'll also refer to why that is a little bit. So John tells us that this lady probably is not of great character, and we find some of that in the story. And it's really from personal choices that seem to be a problem. She's not got the education, which for a woman would have been especially hard. She's also not a Jew. She lives in Samaria, which used to be Jewish territory. It was the northern kingdom. But she is living there in the former capital of the northern kingdom. So the story sort of picks up with Jesus being tired. They've been traveling. They've been taking this other route. And so he had been baptizing. Well, he wasn't, and they go into that very carefully. He wasn't baptizing. His disciples were. And so he's making his way back, and they get to the well, Jacob's well. Pretty famous spot, and it's in this northern kingdom. And so he sits down, and if you've ever wondered how many disciples does it take to make lunch, all 12 of them. They all go into Sychar, leaving Jesus there alone. So that's a little sort of a hint at humor. Okay, I had another sort of story that I was preparing for a retreat, and somebody used a line that I'm going to have to write it down. I've got to use it related to the disciples. So you'll hear that another time. I don't mind when I find these interesting things. So John has this story of this humanity of Jesus being tired. And he is there. He doesn't go in to get lunch and bring it back. They're in an area that was considered unclean, and that's, even though it was the former northern kingdom, it had not ever returned to that as being its background and origin. So Jesus is on this spot, and it estimated the time, and this would be most theologians say it's about noon. So it's the heat of the day. And maybe that's part of being tired. And so he's there, and this woman comes out. She shows up with her water jar. She's going to draw some water, and she's going to take it back for the normal daily use. They're about a half a mile from the town of Sychar. And so she's come that distance in the heat of the day to get water, and that's not the normal time that they say in history that the women usually came out, either fairly early in the morning or still the daylight, but in the evening when it was cooler. And it was also, coming to the well was sort of going to the watering hole. You stand around the water cooler and you talk. And so, but it was always girls' talk, because it was the women who picked up the water. From time to time, depending, there might be men there to help draw and lift and pour, but it was really the woman's task for the family's use to go ahead and gather it. So this is, it's a time that you wonder, why is she out there? Why is she coming that far? And according to some things I read in some of the commentaries, there's actually a well in the village or the town of Sychar. She's walked a half a mile in the heat of the day to go get water where there's pretty much not going to be very many people around. So she's out there, she sees probably Jesus arriving, because I'm sure she has her radar on. She's making sure she's in general safe, and there's a man sitting there, and so she's getting ready to go ahead and dip the water out of the well, and it's supposed to be very deep. And so all of a sudden this man says to her, "Give me a drink." Now, she can look at how he's dressed, and she knows he's a Jew. And her only response to him is, "Wait a minute, I'm a Samaritan woman, and you're a Jewish man. How can you even ask me that? How can you ask me? Everything we do here in Samaria, from what I know about the Jews, is considered unclean. That we're not fit to be considered anything positive." There's also a little bit of surprise probably to her, because a Jewish man wouldn't speak to an unknown woman in public. Now, it wasn't very public with only two of them there, but for him to speak at all would have been just a shock, because everything she knew about the Jews was that they had some very strict rules. And not that she had not seen some passing through, but she probably didn't ever have a conversation with a Jew before. So she has that response. Now, I did find that one of the places I go to from William Barclay, he had a quote that I found pretty interesting about a man speaking to a woman, much less a rabbi. But in this case, he says, "For a rabbi to be seen speaking to a woman in public was the end of his reputation." That sounds pretty extreme. Now, just a man speaking to a woman that was not his wife or one of his children would be considered pretty harsh. But for a rabbi to ruin his reputation just by having a conversation, that seems pretty stiff. Now, I guess I came up with the question, was it that Jesus was just really thirsty, or is he just a different kind of a Jewish man or Jewish rabbi? He's obviously been different, and this is still, as we're hopping through John here in these little steps that I was choosing, it's still very early in Jesus' ministry when this occurs. This is very early, and he's been out where the people were being baptized and people were taking notice. And every time his ministry seems to pick up steam and people are really showing up, that's when he picks up and leaves town. He doesn't want to be noticed in that way. He doesn't want to bring the authorities onto the picture too soon. And being people that have read ahead in the book, then you've got some hints as to why. So she has that quick question about, are you, you're a Jew. Why are you speaking to me? How can you even think of doing that? I sort of related it to what happens in people's individual, sometimes, things in life. There are people that we quit talking to sometime, aren't there? Somebody upsets us. Somebody does something mean or rude or maybe hurts us in some way. That's not too uncommon, especially short term sometimes. in this case, it sort of goes to the level of being more like it seems to go to the level of more like the Hatfields and McCoys. Something happened in the past, and both sides are mad and going to fight it out with the other. And they don't really go to war or anything, but they just won't have anything to do with each other. The feeling is mutual between them. Nations do that. We're suspicious of some nations, and the Cold War was all about that years ago. Sometimes we do that, and we don't really know the other people, but we have our reasons. In this case, it could be sort of like people within, even in a community that have different points of opinion. There's the whole Georgia and Georgia Tech conflict. Sometimes they don't like each other. Or Alabama and Auburn. That was always a big one where I was raised up. Is if you're either an Auburn person or an Alabama person, some families are split over that time during football season. They're not talking to each other because whichever wins the Alabama-Auburn game is going to have it for a whole year, so you don't show up. That was sort of the way my father-in-law handled it. Whatever the family was doing, he didn't show up if Alabama lost to Auburn. In this case, this battle or this dislike of one another actually started in 720 BC, about 400 years before Jesus is on the scene. And the Assyrians had infiltrated and took over the northern kingdom, and then they carted off people. The way they did is they would invade a place and they would divide the population up, so they left like the farmers intact, the ones who at least could keep the base economy going and feed people, and then they moved everybody else to someplace else and they split them up. Well, the northern kingdom was carried away, and then the southern kingdom fell to the same group, the Assyrians, and they were carried off to Babylon, their people. Now, the difference was the northern kingdom, the people started intermarrying, which was part of the control factor, is you blend these people together and they make different family relationships, and they don't have the same nation heritage, so they're not going to rise up together. Well, the southern kingdom, when they were taken away, they kept the heritage straight. They tried not to stray, and if you did stray and you fell in love with somebody that was of another ethnic background, they would, you were gone, you're out of here. They would have a funeral for you even though you weren't dead, and the same can still happen in Orthodox Jewish situations today, where you go and marry a Gentile, you're out of the family, and they leave it like that. So this has happened, and there's this breakup of purity with a lot of these people, and if you remember the history, they get to go back. They allow at some point that we have a king change or an empire is changing, and they allow these people to all start shifting back to their homelands if they want to go. And a fair number of Jews return, both north kingdom and southern kingdom. And so the Jews are rebuilding, and you'll remember the story. They rebuild the wall, and then they come to the point where they're getting ready to rebuild the temple. They've asked for the materials, and the story is that the northern kingdom folks sent some people down and said, hey, we will come and help with the rebuilding of the temple. The response was, you ain't touching our sacred stuff. We don't like you. You're half-breeds. There's nothing about you that's suitable here anymore. And I guess it hurt their feelings. That can happen. So that's where it started. And from then on, they sort of stayed separate. And the northern kingdom, or the Samaritans, they build their own temple. They're still practicing, and they have priests that were a part of the northern kingdom, and they're still practicing. They're trying to worship God. However, there's a difference in where you can worship. The Jewish true Jews are saying, hey, God said you had to be on this mountain in Jerusalem. You had to be on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And the other had built on a Mount Gezerit or something similar to that. And they have each been doing their own. Now, the thing about the Samaritans, they'd also done something else. They rejected, they kept the Torah, the first 5 books of what we would call the Old Testament, and then they rejected what the spiritual writings, which should be like Psalms and things, and they also rejected the books of the prophets. So they were not a part of the religious culture. They didn't know how God spoke to you through a prophet, per se. Some of them still knew the history and had been handed down, but they were living separate religious backgrounds with a very similar connection to God. So I guess we'd say we have the Jews and the almost Jews. We have the ones that are doing it a little different, but it still is based, similar rules, similar bringing of sacrifices, pretty much the same things. So they probably didn't call it the law of Moses, but it was a part of that. Jesus responds to the woman's remark about being a little shocked about him speaking to her at all. by saying, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now, living water in her time would have been a stream, popping up out of the ground, or a river. Living water meant it was moving. You heard it. That's just the translation comes back to that. The well was not considered, even though it may have been a river underground. It was not considered that because you lowered your buckets in. A cistern wasn't considered that, but it was good water. It was healthy water for the most part. Well, she looks over and around him, I'm guessing, and she looks, and he's not got a piece of rope or a bucket or a jar. He has nothing, and she points out to him that he doesn't have the stuff to give her any kind of water. He can't even get water out of the well that's there, and it's 100 feet deep. So how is he can promise this? So basically, it's where and how are you going to get this living water? She would know about any streams in the area. She would understand some of these basic things. Basically, when she responds to him, it's almost like, who do you think you are? Do you think you're better than Jacob? Jacob's well, the one who dug this well, and all the animals have been watered for him, is a gift to our whole, all our families. This has been a staple. The big picture is, Jesus isn't acting like any kind of Jew she had seen or heard about. He spoke to her. That was the first step, and then it doesn't seem that he was rude in his actions. Now, she sounds a little terse if you want to look at it that way, where she might be embittered by some things, but we don't know everything about her yet, and that we find in this story. Now, she doesn't see him as any kind of a threat, and she's actually interacting, and he's talking back. I imagine he's even looking at her as he speaks to her, instead of looking away as if she didn't exist. I don't know, but she really isn't buying whatever this Jew is selling in the way of ideas and other things. She knows, well, the way she thinks of it, the Jews are pretty much an arrogant bunch of know-it-alls that have rejected them. Like I said, it's both ways. They both have a similar thing. After he talks about this spell of living water, that he can give her something different. So eventually she sort of comes back with, okay, then put your money where your mouth is. Show me about this living water. Give me some. I want it to solve my problems. I don't want to have to come out to the well and get water regularly. I just soon be always satisfied. Basically, Jesus says, well, go get your husband. I don't have a husband. Well, the way he saw it was, well, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you live with now is not your husband, but you know what? You have told the truth. You've told me. Now, it might be an incomplete truth. It might be just sort of halfway there. She didn't want to reveal anything to him, but he seems to know everything about her. And I don't know, she probably already had some feelings about her life and the choices she had made over time. We don't have any real background on her, but we know that she has had an extensive set of relationships from what Jesus knows. And I don't know, maybe she thinks she's looking for water to solve just normal thirst. But Jesus is talking about this sort of a spiritual water that can well up inside of a person, that can come to one person, and that person, as they mature and grow in that understanding, then they start giving this living water to other people. It doesn't have to be Jesus that provides the living water of hope and an idea that God has an interest and that there's a forgiveness process. Go get your husband. Here's all these things that you knew about yourself that you didn't know I knew. Now, she knows everybody in the village knows her business. She knows that she knows there's reasons why she decided to come to the well in the midday, and many people theorize that she was trying to avoid. Maybe she was an outcast from the women. And come on, somebody who's had this many relationships and this kind of a cultured life. I mean, she's not a Jew, but even for them, this Samaritan group, this wouldn't have been a common set of number of past relationships that would have been considered normal. You probably didn't want your daughters being around her. You probably didn't want to associate yourself. You could be tainted by this kind of a person, this kind of a relationship. So I don't think she had a lot of friends. And here she's having this weird day where a person who wouldn't normally speak to her because of their own convictions and their own reasons is now speaking to her when maybe almost nobody else did. I don't know, I suspect that she was pretty shocked and maybe jumped when he first spoke. This stranger knows her personal business. I suspect she had a life that are filled with some bad choices. It didn't say she was a widow, so the story might be that she's had 5 husbands, and she must not be poisoning them. Okay, she'd be a widow then, right? So this must be just breakups of some kind. Maybe the 6th one doesn't want to get married because he doesn't want coffee in the morning or something. He's not ready to take any more risk with her. It had to be a bit shocking, and maybe she was already a bit self-condemned, but this man said the truth, but he didn't seem to condemn her for this personal business. The well was way out of town. She's making a place to go out at a time when she's not going to run into most people. She's going to hang out there, and then she meets this man. Did she just happen to meet this man, or is this the event that Jesus had to go through Samaria for? A lot of people theorize it is, that he knows that he has an appointment, that he has a specific person that he's going to talk to that is actually going to carry his message into the village in Sychar, and the people are going to respond. That he's going to take the person with the worst reputation and go, this guy knows all about me. You've got to come out here and see this guy. Not only is her husband going to come, a bunch of people are going to come, and they're going to stay there he's going to stay there several days teaching. And the community is going to become believers that he's the Messiah. He's the one. Now, as she was talking to him, he brings up this subject about her past, and it's like she changes the subject because she changes right away. Say, well, I can see you're a prophet. I've had this problem, this question all the time. People have talked about it, and I've been hearing them, and I've always wondered. Our ancestors say that you need to worship at the temple we have here on Mount Gerizim, and the Jews say that the place to worship is actually at Jerusalem. Why is that? Why is it we're so different? You know anybody that changes the subject if you challenge them? Maybe you do it. Somebody starts knowing too much about some event and you're not ready to talk about it. It happens, doesn't it? Sometimes if you reveal yourself as a Christian, somebody that is having a conversation with may suddenly say, well, those crusades, weren't they terrible? Why is it that God would have done let those people do the crusades? Or maybe why does God let children get sick? And so they change the subjects. They're not talking about maybe, how God loves you and that's shareable. Maybe you're not exactly having a conversation about inviting them directly to church, but maybe you say, I thank you, God. I thank God for all these blessings, and all of a sudden they're changing the subject in some way. It happens. People in our culture will change the subject because just knowing that someone is a Christian will make them uncomfortable. I don't know. Do you think that Jesus just happened to come by? And when she challenges him, I don't think he just happened by, but when she challenges him about, hey, what about this whole temple thing and why? And he doesn't really directly address it. And really the short answer would have been because God said so. Okay, the temple and why the Jews do most of what they do came from God and Moses. So he doesn't just throw out the God said so answer like Mama said so. Or instead he tells her that everything about worship is going to change, and the Jews and the Samaritans are going to be doing it differently if they're going to be true worshipers. They're going to change to something that, they're going to change to something that's in spirit and truth, which is, Jesus raised that in our topic last week, that it had to be different. It wasn't going to be the religion that said it was a time and a place. A lot of things we can do can be religion, and we don't take it that she was very religious as we look at this. We take it that she knew about some religious things, but she didn't really understand the worship process, and she probably wouldn't have been welcome at the temple if she had gone, because they didn't have the real means for her to take care of whatever her issues with a relationship in the past was. Because really she was still living in a life that might have been considered very bad, as in a bad influence, and maybe not yielding to God at all. For her, she needed something to change because she's not getting any younger. She might have been 25, 26, maybe 30. Man, she's ancient maybe. I don't know, she could probably had very little hope if this relationship that she's in that's not formalized by being able to call it a marriage, she may not have another chance. And in the Jewish culture, she'd have a very little chance of surviving, except based on the gifts of people that would, let her beg and she would get something from them. This woman is really no different in her question and understanding of Jesus, because, both of them misunderstand what Jesus says when he tells them that it's going to be different. And with Nicodemus, he sort of got it, I think, that it's like, everything you've depended on as a good Jew and of this high power, that those are the things that they don't matter. All the things you've depended on don't matter. It's going to be different. And now he's told this woman that whatever she does understand, and she doesn't understand it all, he refers to that it's going to change to be Spirit, worshiping under Spirit, worshiping together with the people. It's going to change from being a bunch of rituals to being something that still seems really complicated, but it was actually simpler because it changed to be a relationship of knowing who they're going to worship. So the acts of worship, any idols, anything that was distracting from who they are actually worshiping in spirit and truth is totally different. Instead of depending on just showing up, it's about the right kind of worship. So the woman, she isn't condemned by Jesus on her past. He didn't say it was okay either. He just indicated to her that this worship was going to be less about the place and the time and the rituals and more about something more individual that would be guided by the Spirit to the true worship. Now, as Christians, we come back with our knowledge and say, the true worship is Jesus Christ and how He's bringing this relationship into the world. We have that advantage that we can easily think that we're true worshipers. It's easy to say, I go to church on Sunday and, my family's always gone to church, and the same kind of things that Pharisees and Sadducees and the priests might have depended on. It isn't the issue of worshiping, but what we worship. It isn't the issue of exactly how we worship, but who we worship. Everybody in the time of this woman and in Nicodemus' time were going to be changing to either a new form of worship, or they were being left behind by the way God was anticipated this to go. The Jews are still going to be the chosen people. They're still going to have the opportunity to try to keep the law. But they're going to have to struggle with that all the way to today. So this thing about the Spirit. Truth is pretty easy. We say, okay, that's Jesus. He's the way, the truth, the life. That if we find that in the New Testament. The Spirit seems harder. Last week, Jesus told Nick that he had to be born in the Spirit. He didn't exactly explain in this part of our reading today what this is. It still has to be that there's this change. That we allow the Spirit to come to us and we accept it and it changes us. And then the Spirit guides us. So the Spirit is a gift from God. This ability to try to do true worship means that the Spirit leads us. And while we may still enjoy the songs and receive something from the messages, those are all fine as long as that's not what we worship. What we worship is God through our relationship with Jesus Christ. The song, we choose songs, not how well we felt about the things coming along. It is how the Spirit guides us. True worship opens us up to the actions of God in our lives and world and nation. In a way, I think it's supposed to also open up in us sort of a floodgate, or at least a faucet, because He describes to her living water, and as you read through the text, it says living water that will flow from those who are true worshipers. So we're not just supposed to be bottled up and using the water only for ourselves. It's something that as we grow and mature and change, that we give those taste of living water to people. Maybe it starts as a drip. Maybe it's a floodgate. Different people have different experiences. If Sunday morning is just a check off, and you say, okay, I'm doing these things to keep in a good relationship with God, but you really don't have any repentance in your life, you really don't have any ministry of any kind, and I'm not talking about you have to be out, plowing people's fields for them or something huge. Ministry is to show the love of God to somebody else and to allow that Spirit to leak out of you, the living water to speak to another person. When we come to worship, it should ignite something in us that first we go, I'm not doing anything about my past and I'm not making a choice. And once it ignites us to that, we then can make a change to say, oh, I should be doing something in this direction. I should be using that spark, this love that comes from God, to remind myself, A, to be dependent on God, and to be dependent on God when I go to show other people my weakness and my dependence, my need to help someone else, my desire to be useful. I don't know, do some of you come on Sunday and you hope to leave just feeling a little better about the week? And I'm not trying to say the good feelings that we get from being together and those things aren't there. It's just if you leave with no spark, no filling of the waters that are going to overflow a little bit, then we're missing something. Maybe we're not dependent on the truth, or maybe we're not exactly filled with the Spirit. You can solve that with a conversation with Jesus. You can do that on your own. You can do it, it's just like the worship. You can say where you're sitting or when you're in the car, someplace else. The conversation with Jesus isn't always as pleasant as we would like if we're listening properly. However, it's not going to be condemning. It should be encouraging that there's still the ability to change and do something new. Because Christ is always doing something new in you and me and our community. Whether Jesus comes to you like he did to Nicodemus. Nicodemus came to him seeking something. He didn't know exactly what. Or this surprise encounter for the woman at the well. Jesus is aware and ready to work with you and encourage you. And you may witness a great and moving things. Something refreshing that fills you for the future. God is always offering the relationship and renewing relationships. The problem where you had a problem with the fence line between you and God, God's ready to make it work. He's ready to have the conversation. You have the opportunity to choose what God offers and make a change in your life. Even if you've been a Christian, as far as you're concerned, all of your life, you can renew the relationship to be exciting for you again. All glory be to God.